Good morning. Nick, thank you very much for the invite to speak this morning. Russell, it's lovely to share a stage with you again. You're looking ever so well. Teach First must be suiting you rather than the NAHT. Didn't say that, sorry. So it's interesting, isn't it? Can I have a little bit of feedback from the audience for a moment? If you are not from the English education system, can you put your hand? Ah, thank you very much. It's very nice to see all the international people out there. Some of what I say will chime with you this morning because I've been very fortunate this year to spend some time in other countries and speaking with colleagues from around the world about their education systems, which has very much illuminated my view of ours in England. But to start with, can I just give you a little bit of a flavour of who I am from that perspective? Yes, I'm president of the Association of School and College Leaders. 90,000 members across the country, mainly in secondary schools and colleges, representing senior leadership in those institutions. The day job is executive head teacher of a secondary and primary school and CEO of a multi-academy trust. As you can imagine, you know, I, like many other people, have gone into that area over the last 4 or 5 years. So my experience of the system from a school's perspective is what I'm going to focus on today. And I'm going to look at the impact on students of employer engagement from a head's perspective and give you some illumination, perhaps, linked in with my work in the last year and years before that across the world. First of all, I just want to say something interesting that chimes with what Russell said earlier on. I'm a dad of 2 boys, 11 and just 9. The 11-year-old has just finished his SATs. The 9-year-old is, you know, interested in lots of different things, but they both hate school. They're both bright. What a sad indictment of our education system that is. As I'm a teacher, my wife's a teacher, and something's got to change. Now, I don't know if they're going to go university. I don't know if they're going to go down a different route altogether. But what has really driven me this year as a dad and a head teacher and a president of ASCL, especially as my youngest said, "Dad, you're the president of ASCL. Can't you do something?" I feel like taking him with me to the Secretary of State's office and just allowing him to speak sometimes. But it's very real, of course, isn't it? I'm a great believer that employer engagement starts from a very young age. And if my own children are disconnected from education in a house where they live and breathe education, then the system's got a problem. More of that later, perhaps. But why am I an advocate of employer engagement in schools at a very early age? Well, I'm an advocate because I think it's massively important. I always say to colleagues that students don't grow up at the age of 16 or 18 by flicking a finger. In fact, I don't think I grew up to about 22, 23. But the reality is, it takes time to mature. And just as Russell said earlier on, if you come from a community that's disadvantaged, what you suffer from is a lack of self-belief in general. And I see it because throughout the many years I've been a teacher and senior leader and now a system leader, I've worked in communities across the piece that are disadvantaged. And I see that on so many occasions. And one of the key elements to breaking down that disadvantage over time is improving that self-awareness, making students believe in themselves. And a key way you can do that is to work with employers from a very early age. Each year, I teach some primary school children at year 6. And I ask them a question. I ask them to put up their hands to start with, and then I go into a bit more qualitative feedback, which is, do you know what you want to do when you leave school at 18? 90% of a class will put their hands up, and they'll all have a fixed idea, ranging from wanting to be, yes, a cricketer or a footballer, to a teacher, to a surgeon. And they've known that for quite a few years. So I absolutely agree that we should start employer education far earlier. I also agree that not enough head teachers in this country are an advocate of employer engagement with schools, and we need to increase that. The work of the Careers and Enterprise Company, I think, is crucial in that role. More of that later on. The other reason why I'm an advocate is this. We all went into our jobs when we grew up, at whatever age. And students are the workforce of the future. So how we can think of disconnecting students from business and employers at any age, I don't really know. And I do speak to some head teacher colleagues sometimes who say the purpose of education is not to train students to go and get a job. Although I do agree with them on that. We cannot be oblivious to the fact that they're going to go and get a job somewhere at a certain age. And we need to combine the two. And of course, in this country, we have at the moment the very real realisation of what Brexit will mean for the country in years to come. And more importantly, what has driven me this year, what it will mean for our young people in the country. My boys growing up and going to university over the next 10 years when Brexit has fully taken hold. And every time I speak to politicians and people in the DfE, RSC's team, ESFA, they refer to the fact that we have a generation of students now who will need to step up to the plate for this country in terms of what Brexit will mean in the future. That's a scary experience for them. We're asking a generation to really do something that we haven't done ourselves in many ways, whatever that will mean. And I only believe they can do that if we work more closely with business and employers, and we have that engagement cycle. What I'd like to do for a few minutes is I'd like to talk about what I believe the barriers, from a head's perspective, to creating world-class employer engagement with students across our school system. Now, one of the things that I've become very aware of this year, as I've on a good number of occasions gone to other countries to speak to colleagues in other education systems, is that the English education system is seen as a jewel in the crown of the world. Lots of people in the world want to know what the English education system is doing. We don't always consider ourselves in this country as world-class in some of the things that we do, but we are, and the world know it. There's another aspect to it as well, though. The other aspect is this, that in many of the countries I've been, with many of the colleagues I speak to across the world in education, they are very much looking to the future in terms of their curriculum and their skills base in a more coordinated manner than we are in this country, and that worries me. It worries me that we have an education system that doesn't have a long-term vision of the next 20 years in education. All too often, it has a 5-term vision of the next 5 years in education because it's wedded to the parliamentary cycle. We understand why. But at some stage, that has to be broken for the good of this country and the good of students in this country. And it gives an opportunity. It gives an opportunity for us to create a curriculum and an education system where employer engagement and schools are linked so closely together and understood, because it's what our students will need in the future of education in this country. So to do that, we need buy-in from everyone. And there's significant work to do there. I also chair the advisory group of head teachers for the Careers and Enterprise Company. And there's a strong cadre of 70 leaders, head teachers across the country, working to spread the message out there that employer engagement is so crucial to the future of students in schools. But there needs to be more. But I would agree with Russell and some of the audience, and probably much of the audience who thought about that to do everything that we need to do, we need stability in our system. We don't have stability in the English education system at the moment, and we are struggling now because of the outcomes of that. I'm a passionate believer that that stability will be the way for the future, to underpin the foundation of education in this country. And if we look at employer engagement in schools and setting plans and moving things forward in terms of what does the curriculum look like in the future, what we all need is stability. And we need a government to recognise that over the long term, not just a few years. Because if things are to work and programmes are about to be put in place, and for example the Careers and Enterprise Company and other organisations and the work that they're looking to do want to achieve their outcomes, we need to view it as longitudinal, not just as a few years cycle, a 4 or even a 5-year cycle. So what we need is we need to have patience in cultural change in our system. Because I would say, and I would agree with other colleagues in this room, that we need more head teachers, all head teachers, understanding the important need of engagement between employers and schools. But we will need patience to change that culture across the country, and a very real vision of stability and what that means. And we need a change in our accountability system to make that happen. If we don't have a change in our accountability system, the pressures will remain on head teachers to focus on relentless ways of getting students through exams, turning students off, a la my own boy at home and others. And that cannot be the way for the future. So if we're going to change things like that, and we're going to create the environment for excellent employer engagement in schools, we need that cultural change, and we need our accountability systems to take heed of both business and education in the words that they are saying. And we need business and education policies to connect more than they do today. The other thing that we need is a longitudinal view on what progress is for a child. We measure progress at key stages in this country, and it does affect what we're doing as employers with schools. But why don't we measure progress up to the age of 25? And if there are any researchers out there who want to think, how could we do that from a more longitudinal view of progress with students over time, then we will get a fairer picture rather than what we do at the moment. And that might just change the way we look to do education and employer engagement in this country. So colleagues, there are some of the barriers that I feel exist at the moment, of which we don't all have control of in this room, but I'm absolutely firm that we can influence in our own ways. But when I'm looking to influence other head teachers in the schools that I work with, or other colleagues that I might speak to that lead schools, I look at some of the research that's already out there to try and change perspectives and develop different cultures. So what research is already out there that I found useful as a head teacher to change those perspectives? Well, the NFER report of 2012 lists 10 features of successful school engagement. And I found this really, really useful when I've been speaking with colleagues and setting vision in my own schools and trying to help set vision in other schools. So have a vision, a clear vision of what your school-employer relationship needs to look like and how it will benefit students and young people. Communicate that vision very well and in a deep manner with students, parents, employers and staff. Create partnerships and connections wider afield. Hugely important to create opportunities for the future. Crucially, and I agree with the colleague at the back, have a leadership right from the top that values our partnerships between business and education to create employer engagement. Provide the time and capacity to help that work in a quality manner. Be flexible. I found that really useful in schools. A great idea can come along, but we couldn't possibly do that because we've got set up assemblies for the next few months. We can, if it matters. Connect with the curriculum, hugely important, and plan for that connection with the curriculum. Work out what your needs base needs to be in the future and work to plan your employer engagement around that needs base. And then finally, off this top 10 list that I would agree with and I use, early intervention at that early stage. And that's not just at secondary level, but that's at primary level as well. The other piece of research that I found very useful this year is from the Education Endowment 2018 report on employer engagement. And it looked particularly at 3 areas. Does employer engagement increase attainment? What types of young people are likely to benefit most? And which employer engagement strategies are most effective at increasing student attainment? And it looked at that from a perspective of around the world, just not in England. Its key findings were the following. 9 out of 10 secondary school teachers, 93% of this cohort, say that work experience in employee-related activities can help students do better in exams. Yes, completely agree. If it's done correctly, absolutely. Teachers also said that 1 in 5 pupils, 20%, in a typical year group today have positively benefited from those activities in schools. 20% isn't enough, it needs to be more. Successful work experience placements are believed to have the greatest impact on improving academic attainment, with over a quarter of teachers ranking it as their first choice. This is followed closely by employer-led sessions such as careers events with employee volunteers. And while the sentiment was shared across the state and independent sector, crucially, just as Russell referred to before, the majority of teachers believed that employer engagement in the most disadvantaged schools had the highest impact. Colleagues, we have a real problem in this country between the independent sector and the state sector, exemplified by the drop in funding in the state sector and the increase, well, not the increase, but quite frankly, the independent sector have put up their charges by 20% over the last 5 years to keep that same quality. So it's no surprise, is it, that we see in the independent sector high quality employer engagement and careers advice, and in the state sector less so, because somewhere, somehow, heads have had to make cuts. And that's affected the services that they can deliver. And finally, over half of teachers felt academic achievement can be improved by helping students understand the relevance of education of employment, as well as exposing students to new role models through employer engagement. Yeah, absolutely. And if you get it planned, then your programme can have a real impact. Colleagues, I know this because in my own group of schools in Stoke, we've just done that. We found, for example, that at 16, a range of our students from our secondary schools that were in my trust were not going on successfully with successful outcomes to post-16 education. So in our post-16 offer, we offered our own pre-apprenticeship programme, which we designed. We have 150 students now across all schools going through that pre-apprenticeship programme every year to build their confidence. Once their confidence is built, usually within 9 months, they get an apprenticeship. So I know that matters. And I suppose finally for me, I'd like to look a little bit into the future and see where we might be going. Russell, you mentioned this in your speech, and there's a little bit of a slight difference between myself and Russell. I would agree, yes, you're absolutely right, that the basic things are going to stay the same. Key core skills are going to be needed for students throughout the next 10 years. But I do feel that artificial intelligence is going to have a greater impact than just perhaps some menial jobs. If we look at some of the reports that are out there on the change of artificial intelligence and the way it's going to be developed over the next 5 to 10 years, it is far more than standard tasks of driving a lorry and in agriculture that I think are going to be changed. And some of that work is going to be in the traditional areas that degree students would focus on, being an accountant, for example. So we do need to plan for a future that will be different in 10 years. And yeah, I'm driven by that because I know my two boys are going to be adults at that time entering the labour market. And I am concerned about that. I am concerned about what we can do to ready our students for the future. And I passionately believe that our curriculum that we deliver, yes, I would agree, needs to be flexible and agile, and it moves as technology changes move our culture and our country. But at the same time, it must be balanced, and we must have a sensible balance between academia and skills if we are going to prepare our students for the future in the way they need to be prepared. So the changing job market, especially in artificial intelligence, and we know what globalisation has already done for us, will massively affect our education system and our employer base as we move through into the future. And that fundamental change that I'm seeing across the world, and the wish to change fundamentally for the future and have long-term plans, is going to have some real impacts on Western cultures that perhaps aren't prepared to vision for that change. And that does worry me. So colleagues, there is much for us to contemplate in the work that we do. And if there are any researchers out there that are interested in longitudinal research of the impact of progress over time and how our employer engagement can help up to the age of 25, I will be very interested to talk to you. Thank you for listening, and I believe I'll take some questions now.